Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm delighted to be speaking with Derek O'Riordan. Derek, welcome.
Hi Dan, thanks for having me on.
Super excited to be speaking with you. We've been speaking on the platform X for a number of years, sharing ideas, sharing thoughts, and finally I've managed to persuade you to come onto the Sports Psych Show. So really looking forward to the conversation. Let's start, Derek, where we always do. Tell us a little bit about your work and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks and thanks again for having me on. I think I had a bit of a rubber arm when you invited me on, so very very happy to be here. I guess the starting point for anything is for most people is professionally. What do I do? So currently I work for the National Agency for Sport here in Scotland, having primarily worked within coach development for the agency, developing a unified framework of coach education for Scotland beyond UKCC. Latterly, I'm now working with governing bodies around their overall investment into how the sport is developed, what the governance structures and frameworks look like, and supporting our performance colleagues around that investment as well. I also work as a lecturer in sport management and coaching sport in the Faculty of Health Sciences and Sport here at Stirling. And I have a number of different things that I do on the side in terms of coach development. So I work in situ with coaches, and there's one coach in particular that I'm working with in the lead up to the Paralympic Games this year. And I coach Rugby Union. That's my passion. That's my first love as a player and a coach, and I coach here in the Premiership in Scotland.
Tell me a little bit about your rugby past. Did you play?
Yes, I was a blunt instrument, not a very talented rugby player, but a very aggressive one. And I was lucky enough to play in certain quarters in the world. Got a chance to play in New Zealand, played in England for a bit, played in Italy, and rugby brought me to Scotland, and it's where I've lived most of my adult life. So it's been pretty good to me as a sport in terms of life experience. And as a coach, started off as many people do as a development officer, delivering rugby to kids in schools, trying to get 4-year-olds to get engaged in rugby. Good luck to anybody who wants to try and do that. Um, as well as coaching within the pathway, so skills coach within the national age grade program, which progressed to coaching the women's national team for 3 years, which then led on to coaching in the Premiership for a number of years now in Scotland with a couple of clubs, as well as a brief hiatus lower down the leagues while I was doing a postgraduate program.
You mentioned there you were a blunt instrument, which I'm sure isn't true, but an aggressive player who I think you used the term lacked a little bit of a talent or ability, which again I'm sure wasn't true. But can you kind of break down what an aggressive player but that lacking ability kind of looks like essentially on the pitch? What does that mean?
Uh, I guess how would you describe it? A bit of an enforcer. Rugby's predicated on the idea of getting over the gain line, and playing against a retreating defence where tons of space tends to open up either in the backfield when players need to come higher in the line, or space around the edges when two or three people need to tackle somebody. I relished being that gain line player. I relished the physical side of the game. I didn't pass the ball very often. I tried to kick the ball on occasion, and then a coach would shout at me from the sidelines. So I didn't very often after that. But you look, the way I am as a human being, certainly when I was younger, quite hot headed, chip on my shoulder, bullied quite a lot at school. Felt that rugby gave me an avenue to express myself physically in a way that I couldn't do, in terms of my life experience at school. And I built an identity around that. I was seen as quite an abrasive player who was quite disruptive over ball on the defensive side of the game. And yeah, it just allowed me to find a place within a sport when I wouldn't say I was as skillful as anyone else, but sure as hell I was never going to not allow myself to be that person who ever took a back foot on the field.
I think it's really interesting because you've been a skills coach. within the national setup.
Yeah.
I think there's a really interesting juxtaposition there. I mean, when I was involved with England rugby, Eddie Jones always used to say to me, "Dan, it's a game of violence." I won't do an Australian accent, but Dan, it's a game of violence, mate. It's a game of violence. He always used to say to me with a kind of a twinkle in his eyes, I suppose challenging me to be a sports psychologist and develop mental skills for coaches within this game of violence. And there seems to be, and I'd love to get your comment on this trade-off between aggression, violence, if you want to call it that, but aggression and physical dominance with the skills side of the game. Do you think that they work conversely? Is a challenge for a skills coach to marry the two in such a sport as rugby?
Well, that's a big question. I guess it depends on what the opposition's trying to do to you, right? So if you're playing against a defence that is high pressure, they want to close down time and space on the ball, then if you're the skills coach on the attacking side, then surely you want to be able to develop a team's ability to catch the ball out of the body, transfer it really quickly, or be able to drop passes off their shoulders when they know that there's a defender in close proximity. I think it does work in some form of synergy, but it depends on what side of the ball you're coaching and what outcome you want. So if you want to be a high pressure team that has tons of line speed on the defensive side of the ball, then you don't necessarily have to be that skillful. You just have to have loads of intent. Whereas if you want to be a bit more methodical about your defense and it's about containment and it's about shepherding teams, and you're thinking 2, 3 phases ahead where you want to place them, then there might need to be a lot more skill around what you're trying to do in terms of how you get off the line, put the brakes on, track appropriately, know when you're folding into and under, jamming in, jamming out of a defense, and it becomes a lot more technical. Um, it really depends on your disposition as a defense coach. Some people say defense is really easy to coach. I would argue it's absolutely not, because there's so many intricacies in it. And the more and more attacks are becoming sophisticated, so too does the defense need to be. And it's interesting that when rugby first became professional, we looked to rugby league to support the development of the union defence, and now more and more we're looking to league to unlock the defence that's been built up over time by these ideas from rugby league. So, does rugby league have all the answers? I don't know, but certainly it seems like a game that's played ball in hand and on the run in a way that's really, really good.
I think the way you've answered that is really interesting because you've reached on a lot of domain specific knowledge there. You've talked a lot of rugby speak there, a lot of tech tac
Mm.
speak. I think that's interesting because I suppose my question in many respects was quite heavily, not completely, but quite heavily, because it suggested physicality, but it was quite heavily mentally oriented. And so, as a rugby coach, as a skills coach, as a coach developer, when you think about the mental side of rugby, or perhaps any sport, are you thinking about that from the perspective of the tech tac detail? You haven't really answered the question from the perspective of mindset. You've looked more towards context, the context of the game model, the game plan, the principles of play, the technical, tactical detail. I just noticed that about your answer.
Yeah, and I guess if you think about the mental side of the game, what we want to do is support players to make decisions under time constraints.
Yes.
So if a player is playing against, let's say, a containment defense, so that is a softer defense, they don't get off the line really hard. They may take one step off the line and try and take a team or shepherd a team to a sideline. Then the attacking side will have more time on the ball. They'll probably have more space to play with, and therefore it's not necessarily that they've got more options available to them, but they can perhaps take their time around identifying where the space is in that defensive line, whether it's in the front line or in the backfield. Whereas if you're playing against a blitz defense, pressure defense, then the idea is for the defensive line to get in line or get in between the passing channels and cut out time and space, effectively suffocate an attack. Now, if you can develop rugby players who can make decisions in both of those scenarios, in both of those contexts, then you're on to a winner, right? because they will find a way of unlocking a defence irrespective of what that defence is chucking at you. Now, on the defensive side of the ball, what you're trying to do is buy more time and space. So within the tackle contest, we might ask defending players who make a tackle to buy time. So we call that time and tackle. And essentially, what they're trying to do is slow down ball to allow the defense to get set, to allow the defenders to get a read on what the attacker trying to do, so that they can then decide whether or not they're going to come really hard off the line, if their number's on or number's up, or if their number's down, they become soft and they start taking them to an edge. So it is a game about buying time on the defense or buying time on the attack.
This is really interesting. So what I've written down there is it sounds like there's a kind of a mini formula for how you perceive the mental side of rugby. The mental side is context for decision making. It is in the context, who you're playing against, who you are as a team, your identity, how you like to play, the challenge of the opposition. You're having conversations probably with your fellow coaches around that context to make a decision about how you're going to best develop decision makers within your team. Does that kind of formula fit neatly with what you're trying to do?
Yeah, we're venturing into this idea of getting on the same page and having a shared mental model of what it is that we might do. So that is, what are the cues and clues within the game that might coordinate a set of action or actions around players based on what the pictures the opposition are giving you. And luckily, within our level, we get access to video of the teams that we're going to be playing against that week, and therefore we can coordinate training, plan training around that, and design some small-sided games or map what the opposition might do, and then have a discussion throughout the week about how we might go about either nullifying that or exposing and amplifying some opportunities within the game because we've spotted a weakness somewhere. So we don't go into a game devoid of a plan. We don't go into training devoid of a plan. We've got an idea of what it is that we want to do with and to the opposition in order to give ourselves a competitive advantage. So yeah, I think what you're talking at there perhaps is this notion of a shared mental model or a shared conception of how we're going to go about the game in any given week.
In my work, more and more, I'm finding this idea of a shared mental model absolutely critical. A single term, perhaps, or single word we could potentially use is alignment. Alignment is so important vertically and horizontally across the team, perhaps even across the organisation if we're talking about bigger sporting teams and organisations. But when you say shared mental model, are you talking coaching staff? Are you talking players as well? And you've given us a couple of ideas of what that looks like or how that is done. Can you broaden that for us a little bit?
Yeah, so coaches, staff, players, I think all need to be relatively on the same page. And look, when you talk about vertical and horizontal, there, I think what you're perhaps getting at is coherence.
Yes.
And coherence can be seen of in two ways. And forgive me for quoting some colleagues, but I have done some work in this area. Jamie Taylor and I have done a fair bit of work in this since 2018.
And Jamie's been on the podcast to talk
Jamie's been
about this, so this
previously
is
on the
great.
podcast.
Yeah.
So coherence to me could mean one of two things. One, it's about how different inputs to the system being the team, are systematically combined. But equally, when we talk about the way in which we talk, act, and behave around each other, it's about how those messages mutually reinforce each other. So what I don't want is to have an S&C coach or a set piece coach delivering a different message to what I'm saying, but equally um, not listening to or responding to some of the messages that are coming in from players around what they are feeling and seeing within the game, because we all offer different perspectives. And what we want to arrive at is not necessarily that the coaches are the all seeing and all knowing, but rather by the end of the video session on a Thursday evening, when we're about to head out to do our last bit of mapping, everybody is on the same page. Everybody's had a chance to negotiate what the plan looks like going into the weekend, but that is loosely based upon a broad framework that we have, because making changes within a team sport like rugby takes time. You can build flexibility into your game plan, your game model, but you can't rip it up and start again week to week. So it's understanding how we leverage aspects of our game, particular parts of our defence, our kicking game, particular people within the environment, so personnel. So you might have a halfback that's so a halfback being nine, scrum half. They're responsible for continuity really within the game. They pass the ball from every breakdown. So you might have a left-footed nine and you might have a right-footed nine. Um, and depending on who you have at 10 or 15, you might want to have both a left and a right footer on the field to give you the best opportunity to either clear your lines or put a team under territorial pressure. So you have this set of ingredients that fit within your overall game model, and you understand, what are the best 15 that I'm putting out on a Saturday relative to how we've been developing, but equally what we're playing at that on the weekend in terms of their strengths, their weaknesses, what we want to expose, what we want to amplify, where do we want to get an advantage.
It was interesting what you mentioned, the demands you place on your strength and conditioning coaches, or we could think of sports scientists or even sports psychologists here. What you said about the importance of everybody talking, acting, and behaving in the same way, speaking the same language, and that's the shared mental model that's coming from top down. There's coherence there, as you said. Yet at the same time, you want them to be able to flex their attention. So pay attention to individual differences, individual specificity, listen to the language, and observe the behaviors of players to kind of fuse that top down and bottom up together is kind of what I'm hearing. That flexing of attention seems important to you.
No, 100%. Look, rugby as a sport, in terms of how it's played, isn't static. It's quite a dynamic sport. But equally, we are effectively an amateur team. You know, game day is day zero, and then you're into training on a Tuesday, training on a Thursday. The guys have their own individual S&C outside of that. They all have jobs, families. And if we're quite rigid around our approach to what we're doing with the team, then it just means that we've got a lack of adaptability and flexibility in terms of when we arrive on the field. And when I came into the environment that I'm in just now, a couple of years ago, the lack of rugby IQ was pretty obvious. The guys had an inability to run a kicking game, to be flexible in defence, to even recognise and understand what pictures the opposition are giving you, to then respond to that with a certain tool that we might have within our repertoire of moves. Let's call it that. Just simply wasn't there. So it's taken us 2 years to get to a point, and that included one relegation battle, to arrive at the point where we've got a squad of players now who I think are more sensitive to what the opposition are giving to them, more open to ideas, but equally more confident in coming to us as coaches and saying, well, actually, we don't think this is going to work in this situation. Here's why. I think that's a great position to be in, because suddenly it becomes more of uh, a collaborative environment between the coaches and the players, and not necessarily an autocratic one, where I am professing and projecting a game model onto the players because I've got some degree of authority because I've got some qualification. Absolutely not. And look, if people came into our environment, they would think, "What the hell is going on here?" Because humor is a big part of what we're about. Back into the amateur side of things, if we're not adding value to people's lives when they cross the gates into the club on a Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, then we're doing our job wrong. Rugby should be enriching, it should be fulfilling, and it shouldn't be a burden. And if we're creating an environment that is overly professional with amateur players, then we're perhaps doing things wrong. So for us, it's not about building a trophy cabinet. Really, it's about adding value to boys' lives.
I'd like to come back to that because I think it's important, that environment piece. And I suppose related to what I'm about to ask you, you use the term collaboration there, and earlier you used the term negotiation. You talked about everybody contributing. It makes me think of the term being an autonomy supportive coach. And my colleagues in sports psychology are often leaning on self-determination theory when it comes to autonomy supportive coaching. Could you speak a bit to your attitude towards that? Because it feels like you're a little bit of both. It feels like you feel that as a coach you're going to set certain tones, certain principles, certain game models, but you
Mhm.
want people involved. What's your thoughts on this idea of being autonomy supportive?
Well, the players feel like they have some degree of control over what the program looks like, over what the game model looks like, over what Tuesday Thursday looks like. I guess if we're going to be into self determination theory, then competence has a part to play within that as well, and that's aligned to the way in which we deliver our sessions. So we have a mix of what we call DNA, which is the micro skills that make us us. And we have our small-sided games, which are aligned to the broad game model that we have. And then, of course, there's the relatedness piece, where everybody within the environment can feel some degree of connection to each other. And I think that's the one bit that we really, really get right at the club that I'm at the moment. When I arrived, the players would openly say that they wanted to be the best pub team in Scotland, um, even though even though they were in the Premiership. But I had a board that wanted to be a top four club, and I had to, again, back to this negotiation piece halfway through the year. It's okay, how are these things incompatible? And then arrive at a point where, with 5 games left, how do we survive within this league, and then push on to prove ourselves worthy of being in the Premiership, while at the same time still embracing the fact that socially we really enjoy each other's company, and are quite aligned to the amateur roots of the game, which involved copious amounts of alcohol on a Saturday when you win, lose or draw. And I don't think we should lose that within the club, because ultimately, back to what I said in terms of adding value, we are an amateur club. We do not pay any players, even though we are in a league where a number of clubs pay their players, either on a part-time basis, or they're working as development officers at the club. We just don't see that as being a sustainable route for us and our environment.
Derek, I always talk about joy and seriousness being on two different continuums, and we can visit both at the same time. I don't know if that's true. It's a bit of a hypothesis or a philosophy, if you
Mm.
like. But listening to you, I mean, it was really interesting to hear you say there that your board, in essence, set an outcome objective, which sounded like quite a
Mm.
stretched outcome objective, a top four. And yet, so much of what you're speaking about, I would suggest, speaks to this notion of a psychologically informed environment, a pie that we're talking so often about these days in modern day sport, and the contribution of sports psychology there. A difficult balance to be had, surely. Is that something that's been a sort of a day-to-day concern for you, striving to hit the heights that your board want, and yet at the same time trying to create an environment that is meeting the needs of your people?
So, interesting story. My first year at the club, we lost our first 9 games in the bounce,
Wow.
and the the jungle drums were beating to say that I might be getting the heave ho, um, which I'm grateful they haven't, because we went on into that second round and won 5 games, and survived. But I guess that comes back to the coherence piece, but equally at the degree of integration within the club now. That's how mutually supportive different aspects of the club are to each other. And you can look at the board in isolation, you can look at the coaching group, and you can look at the players all as sort of separate bodies within the club. But really, for me, it's around being open and honest around where the team are at. Um, Whilst you might believe that they've got potential to be top four, the fundamentals, if you want to call it that, just simply weren't there, and that's around, as I said, rugby IQ, confidence, adaptability, flexibility. The resilience wasn't there because they habitual losers in games. We had to turn quite a lot around, and I seem to remember I reached out to you at one point. because a little bit of serendipity on something that I listened to around this notion of going out and being willing to lose in order to win. I think it was a cricket example was on one of your podcasts, I think maybe a year ago.
Yeah.
And that became a mantra for the tail end of the season. And we also did a little bit of theming around the Great Escape because, a turning point for us was at Christmas. The Great Escape was on TV. And we made a big hoo-ha about that in the tail end of the season. That just allowed us to, as a whole club, to rally around this idea of avoiding relegation. And, fast forward into year two, we've got a board that are really supportive of what it is that we're trying to achieve as a club. I talked about our amateur status. We don't pay players, but what we do now do is pay for a meat pack for all players, whether you're a first 15, second 15, or third 15 player. Every Thursday you get a pack of meat and away you go. And the board underwrote that they pay for that. Anything we ask of them, they do for us just now. And there was 3 points this season when we were fourth in the league and looking like we were heading towards the playoffs. But a couple of things just knocked us off our stride, and that was just consistency. And we've got a plan of how we deal with that moving into next year. But yeah, I certainly feel like from where we were, which was sort of a disparate, sort of fragmented club in terms of players, coaches, board, to being one that's really, really aligned, to use your word, and the level of coherence within the club in terms of everybody understands where we're at and where we're going. And it certainly feels like we're all pulling in the same direction, which is a lovely place to be. A lovely place to be.
I do find it interesting, Derek, how you're like me. You're really into the scientific side of sport and value the importance of being evidence informed or based or evidence grounded, whatever term you like to use. And it's not either or, but and at the same time, we so often have to draw back towards philosophies like daring to lose to win, and this idea of stories and creating themes.
Yeah.
And I'm not suggesting that those kind of things cannot be scientifically investigated, but science aside, so often it's things like themes and philosophical approaches to performance that ultimately lie at the sort of final frontier of human performance.
Yeah, look, we're touching a little bit on science and philosophy here. I think at times we can over systemify things. I think we can overthink the scientific side of sport, and we forget, back into your point around theming. We're homo narrans. We are storytellers as a species, and sometimes we can just. I think we should just leave the science behind and just understand that we're human beings coalescing around a club, supporting each other as men to go out and play a boys' game. I think we forget how lucky we are playing a kids' game as adults and getting to play at the level that we are. I'm going off in a bit of a tangent here philosophically a wee bit, but what in essence I'm saying is, look, we're really, really lucky to play the game that we are. If we try and burden it with too much science, too much data, too much analytics, we lose sight of what it is that we're there to do, which is, as I said at the start, add value to these guys' lives when they cross the gate on a Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday.
And just dwelling on this a second, because I just think I don't think you're going off on the tangent. I think this is really interesting because this is a tension I face myself in my work. Because again, it's important to me, and I'm influenced by good people who will talk to me about sports psychology is a psychological science. The importance of being psychologically underpinned. And yet, at the same time, the reality is when you walk into a medical department as a sports psychologist and you start conversations, or you're in a coaches meeting and you're having conversations there, so much of what you're talking about is extraordinarily difficult to scientifically underpin. So I've always felt there is a tension between striving to do what you feel is the right thing as a practitioner, and possibly the right thing as a coach, with the effective thing in the moment. And effective isn't always easy to grasp the science, if you like. And so I think it is. I don't think I'm going to formulate a question here, Derek, but I think it's a tension that is important. I suppose my question to you is: do you feel that tension every day?
all the time, all the time. I mean, look, you scroll through X or Twitter as it was, you listen to podcasts, and there are so many people professing about how you ought to coach, what methodologies you should employ, what is and isn't effective in the context of sport coaching, and you can get lost in all of that. But in so doing, you might lose yourself. Um, and I think back to, I got sacked from a Premiership coach a few years ago because I lost myself a wee bit in all of that. And I spent too much time worrying about what other people thought of me and thought of my coaching. I just desperately wanted to be accepted in that environment. That I was very inauthentic as a coach. And that played out in some behaviours, and I didn't lead myself well on the tail end of that contract. But um, certainly within the club that I'm in just now, I am 100% authentically me, and I feel more accepted there than I have anywhere else. Largely because I've just let go of this idea of trying to be the most knowledgeable, most authoritative, most scientifically informed, evidence-based coach. Yes, all of that sits and lurks in the background of the decisions that I make and the judgments that I make and the analysis that I do on players and the way in which we design training, but I don't lead with it anymore. I don't wear it as a badge to say I'm a level four coach and these are my approaches to coaching. I'm Derek O'Riordan. I'm a rugby coach first and foremost. I'll treat you all as individuals. I'll support you in terms of your development. And yes, I have some ideas that I use from science and psychology and physiology and coaching science that inform my practice. And look, I've got a very specific example of this where we set up a practice one night where we had three different stations. And you would think logically, left to right, the stations would be numbered one, two, three, but I numbered them backwards intentionally because it just chucked in a little bit of confusion. And I remember one of the players going like, "Why are you doing this to me?" It's like, "Well, it's just extraneous cognitive load, Paul. I'm just trying to get you to think a little bit harder around what you're doing. So I'm putting a bit more pressure on your decision making." And I jokingly said, "Imagine a coach actually knowing what they're doing here, not accidentally numbering things wrong." So there are bits there that we do, you know, to support player development, to support player decision making. But I guess in a really rounded way, and what I'm trying to get to is that I don't feel it's appropriate to lead with that because you're setting yourself up to be someone you're not.
When you say lead with that, what do you mean? Because I kind of get this notion of in the background, you've done something
Yeah.
purposefully there, you've misnumbered, and in your mind, you've immediately gone to cognitive load theory and extraneous cognitive load, which is, quite an advanced coaching explanation for what you were doing. So you have got a scientific underpinning there. But what's the difference between having that and putting that kind of front and center?
Look, I guess early on in my career, um, as with many coaches, they would probably tell you that they become really technical
Yeah.
and try and evidence that they know the square root of the peanut when it comes to coaching to try and get some credibility.
Yes. Okay.
Um, because it is a game where you're trying to influence, certainly within my environment, influence 50 people to go with you on a journey. Um, and, they want to have some degree of confidence that you are an expert in or have expertise in something. But first and foremost, I think the players need to accept you for who you are. And if you lead with sort of a real overly technical language, try and profess and project yourself as an expert in something, you lose sight of what it is that you're there to do first and foremost, which is build connections with these individuals who, effectively, back to your point around Eddie Jones, you're asking them to engage in a violent act, several violent acts on a Tuesday, a Thursday, and a Saturday, and if they don't like you, if they don't think that you are being authentic, then 9 times out of 10, they're not even going to run through toilet paper for you, never mind say a brick wall. So for me, I don't lead with that sort of I am an expert in something anymore. I lead with I'm Derek O'Riordan. I'm interested in you. I'm interested in developing you with you um, and adding value to your life as a rugby player.
You're Derek O'Riordan, rugby coach, but you're also Derek O'Riordan, the coach developer.
Hmm.
How much of that is about connection? How much of that is your knowledge? What does coach development mean to you?
Um, Supporting individuals to find and fulfill their potential as coaches. Um, there's no getting away from the fact that there is a contractual obligation in coach developer work that there's a tension there. You know, you're contracted by the sport to work with a coach, not contracted by the coach to work with them. Quite often, they struggle to make sense of why it is that you're there, why you're in their environment. Um, some coaches feel like, you know, are you being sent in to fix me? I mean, I imagine that's not too dissimilar to what it's like as a sports psychologist working with a coach for the first time.
Can be, yeah.
And so, um, you know, certainly in the early stages of contracting with a coach, it's about coffee, having a yarn about, you know, who they are, where they've come from, what their influences are, what their philosophy on coaching is. Yeah, and that might take two or three coffees before we even contract what going into the environment looks like. Um, so coach development isn't something that's done overnight or over a week or over a month. It's done over a couple of years. And it is entirely relational. Relational in the sense that it's about the relationship that you have with the coach, the relationship they have with the other practitioners and coaches within their environment, the relationships they have with the athletes, and it's understanding um, what those interactions, micro interactions, macro interactions look like in terms of coaching practice, but equally what they look like in terms of athlete outcomes. So, how does one coach speaking to another in an environment inform how an athlete picks up and considers what practice is going to look like that day? Are coaches having an argument? Are they do you know what I mean? Are they having a collegiate conversation? Are they embracing each other when they walk into the environment? What are these subtle things that then athletes pick up in what we might call a hidden curriculum that might then shape the way in which they interact with the coach, interact with the environment that day? I find that fascinating as a coach developer. When you step back and look beyond just the pedagogical interface and more of the environmental influences um, around where the coaches work, I think it's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. So I've gone off one there again.
No, no, no. I mean, so you're trying to get the 360 degree view around the coach. Is that kind of what you're trying to do to get a feel for where the coach is at and the specific challenges that coach faces?
Yes, 100%.
Is there a difference, do you feel, between coach development and coach education? If so, what are they? And is coach education a part of that development?
Um, yes, I think I've heard quite a lot and seen quite a lot about coach education essentially getting a bit of a bad rap. Um, but it's essential that coaches develop the resources, uh, the procedural and decorative knowledge that they might need to be able to practice effectively, if that's even such a thing. And then coach development can work really well with that in terms of supporting coaches to unlock those resources that they developed in education and leverage those against what the wants and needs are of the athlete or the program, and sensitizing them to entry points for particular types of knowledge and for particular types of problems. I don't see coach development as telling coaches what they ought to do. It's about recognizing that coaches are have resources and are resourceful, and our role is to support them to fulfill their potential by unlocking those resources in context.
When you get involved with a coach for the first time, I mean, you're stepping into environments that you don't know much about. You know, for example, gymnastics. Do you think it's your role as a developer to start to learn the language and the specific challenges involved in that sport, or are you better served having minimal understanding or knowledge of the sport in question?
It depends on the sport. So if I use judo, for example, there are specific types of throws with a specific name, particular scoring systems, that you know you need to understand what the intentions of the coach are in terms of um, what they're actually doing with an athlete. And I'm working with a coach who's working with a visually impaired athlete, so language becomes really, really critical within the context of their relationship. Um, so there's a benefit, depending on what sport you're going into, to understand some of that in advance, or it can actually strengthen the relationship by evidencing how curious you are to understand, again, the square root of the peanut of what it is that the coach is trying to do, and all that shapes and influences the relationship that you have, because there's a genuine interest there in understanding. And Bob Muir, who's done quite a lot of work around coach development, will always say, seek first to understand before trying to be understood. Um, so I wouldn't ever think that I would be in a position where I could offer advice to coaches in the early stages of the relationship, because I'm still trying to make sense of who they are as an individual, who are the individuals they're working with, what's the environment they're working in, both physical and cultural, to arrive at a point where I have a sense of what might be going on for the coach right now. Getting some entry points to have some conversations around how they might make sense of things that perhaps I'm noticing in the environment. And then that might lead to a stream of work that might, create a workflow that would be 18 months, 24 months, of work between me and the coach.
You're a coach at the coalface, coaching rugby players, and you have been for many years. You're a coach developing other coaches, observing them coaching their athletes. Do you think everything is coachable?
Oh, I thought you were going to hit me with easy questions, Dan. Uh, is everything coachable?
Is everything coachable? Because I battle with
To
this.
set some context, we've both sat back in our chairs here because this is obviously a big question.
Yes. Well, I just think I'm so into every aspect of sports, and as a sports psychologist, I take a broad definition of sports psychology, and I, where appropriate, I stay in my lane all the time, but where appropriate, I try to contribute. So, for example, the perceptual cognitive side of
Mm,
things are really interesting to me. And I think of, I don't want to go back to what we were talking about 20 minutes ago and the decision making side of things, but when I think of anticipation and decision making, the ability to see and appropriately and quickly read the cues and the clues, as you mentioned earlier, in anybody's environment, whether it's basketball, football, rugby, those kind of sports, but even through to individual sports like judo, combat sport, where reading the opposition is so
mm.
important. Are these things how coachable are they? Are they more coachable than we think? We just don't spend enough time trying to coach them. 30 years ago, there would be a lot of people around who just say, dismiss it at hand, and say, oh, that's not coachable. Decision making isn't coachable. I think more and more now with, I think of the great work of, say, Mike Ashford on fast decision making, slow decision making, and no thought decision making. And just the more empirical evidence coming out is suggesting to me that those kind of things, and I'm just only thinking perception, the cognitive perceptual side of things here, but there's so many things. Can we coach the athleticism? Can we coach the moves, the technique, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, I think in that regard, most things are probably coachable. I think there will be obvious things to people who are more educated than I that aren't. But if I think back to the judo context that I'm in at the moment, so a visually impaired athlete can't see that well, but the perceptual system that we're trying to develop, or the coach is trying to develop, is the haptic one. The sense of
Yes.
feel and touch, shifts in weight, shifts in momentum, and what those things mean for an athlete who can then go and transition into either a throw or a grapple, or or a defense. I think it's fascinating to see the coach that I'm working with supporting the athlete to make sense of what those sensations mean,
Yeah.
and how might they respond um, when they feel a particular shift in weight, or they feel somebody off balance somewhere, or they feel a particular grab or hold begin to release. It's absolutely fascinating then to see how the athlete responds to that. But equally, back to your point around time. Um, yes, if all skills can be developed, we have to give it the benefit of time, and it might not take a day, a week, a month or a year, but it can happen. It's just, in my view, consistency, um, circling back. So not continually hammering a particular skill over a number of weeks, but continually returning to that over time. Um, Means that, back to that idea of integration, mutually supportive developmental experiences over time. that we might do something this week within the context of our program that we might not revisit for another 4 months, but we know that we're still building upon something that we did 4 months ago, right? Because it might lead to a particular way of getting on, if I'm back into rugby context, a particular way in which we want to exploit the backfield by what we're doing on our kick chase, then, I know that we're not going to develop our kick chase over the course of a week or a month. It might take us 6 months to get there, knowing what I know about the players now in terms of the pace at which they learn. I hope that makes sense.
It makes complete sense, and I know I'm taking us down a particular rabbit hole here, but I just think this is fascinating because this crops up so much in my work, and we work in similar worlds. And I'm thinking of how, if we were to hypothesize that everything is coachable, there might be certain physical aspects that might not be coachable. So not everybody's going to run as fast as Usain Bolt. There's certain physical aspects that are going to limit, but if we think of so much of coaching, technical, tactical, the cognitive side of things being coachable, listening to you, it's making me think of three limiters: time, resources, and appropriateness. I'm thinking I'll borrow from my own world of,
And relevance.
and relevance. Yeah, absolutely. So everything can be coachable, but we might not have the time, we might not have the resources, it might not be appropriate at any given time, relevant. During COVID, there was a golfer called Bryson DeChambeau who used that time because in golf, modern day golf is very much, I'm not saying it's only a power game, but there's definitely, with modern equipment, the game has changed a lot in terms of how far they hit the ball, and you want to get it as far out there as possible. That makes sense. And Bryson DeChambeau, the American golfer, used time during COVID where there was no golf being played or fewer golf tournaments being played to go in the gym and got himself absolutely huge. And so he had the smarts to go and do that, because so often golfers are scared to do that because it's going to impede with your game more than anything else. But he utilized that time, and he coached himself to hit the ball, I don't know, 50, 70, 100, 50, at least 50 yards on average further. So there was a time factor there, and I would have always said that you probably can't coach yourself or somebody coach you to hit the ball on average 50 yards further. So I think that's interesting. But I think feel free to comment on that. But where I also want to bring this back to you and your role every day. I mean, you talk about your role, I think, in youth sport and developing the right infrastructure and the right processes and plans, within youth sport. And again, I'm going to come back to that notion of tension. There's a tension between seriousness and play, if you like, early seriousness, early specialization, etc., etc. And I'm all for the importance of participation and the participative period of life. Let's call it 6 years old through to 12 years old, whenever you want to call it, before seriousness kicks in too much. Yet at the same time, there are definitely young people who are ambitious, not at 6 years old necessarily, but at maybe 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 years old, where a lot of people would say that's when they're participating, it shouldn't be too serious. Maybe it shouldn't be too serious. Yet at the same time, at that period, if you're introducing them to certain things, let's say around the perceptual cognitive side of things, if you're getting them interested in decision making, which they would grasp onto a lot of the time, if you're introducing them to forms of deliberate practice, which could be important for their development, that's a time, I think, where these young people are very coachable, yet all of that might be dismissed as being too serious, too soon, too young. Are you grabbing where I'm coming from here?
To some extent, I guess seriousness is a serious word, right? And I think too often we leave a word out of either participation or performance, which is joy. So where's the joy of engaging within the sport, whether that be from a performance or a participatory perspective? That to one side, this notion of deliberate practice, which certainly from my reading of it wasn't necessarily considered with sport in mind. Deliberate practice was really this notion around the fraction of 1% of people who engage in really regimented practice to become really expert in something. But of course, you can't do that with certainly from a rugby perspective, I don't think that's possible because you need to have a degree of balance.
Hmm.
You can't be all serious all the
Mm.
time, and it's why I perhaps really step back from this idea of and I've got two kids. I've got a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old. This idea of specializing really early jars me because there are any number of benefits to kids experiencing any number of different sports for a period of time. This idea of transferable skills or uh, traces of one sport being left on another. Whilst I'm not deep into the science of that, you can certainly see that from a um, anecdotally, certainly within my children. My son is involved in golf, has played tennis, likes badminton, swims, is a goalkeeper in football, but played outfield yesterday at left midfield, which was an interesting experience for him playing an age group up. And he's played rugby, plays basketball. Now, would he be a standout in any one of those sports? No. But is he really dexterous with his hands? Can he anticipate a ball coming close in, far out? Does he have variability in terms of his ability to cope with sudden changes in what a defender does? Yeah, absolutely. There's a subtlety to his movement that I think he wouldn't have had he not engaged in a number of sports. And therefore, engaging play, or sorry, encouraging play, exploration of different sports just provides a richer tapestry, a broader repertoire of skills, both from a movement perspective, but equally anticipatory skills that you wouldn't necessarily get by engaging in the types of regimented practice that might be associated with the deliberate practice. I'm not going to call it a camp, but this idea of it, which generally then fosters this idea of perhaps drills or a reductionist view of how we might develop athletic performance over time. And I think uh, popular culture and popular psychology has got a lot to answer for when it comes to these ideas of developing, your 10,000 hours, which I
Yes.
still hear.
Yep.
And you've got this race to the bottom to try and get more time on task with athletes within a particular sport, um, when that is redundant, absolutely redundant with all of the naturally occurring experiences that kids can have when they sample a variety of sports, and then have the autonomy, back to that word, um, to engage with and invest in a sport later on in life that they are deeply passionate about, but still having the traces of everything else. Uh, I'm going to use a really controversial word, traces of all of these sports on their schema. Um, dare I say it? So they've got these repertoire of movements that they can call upon, irrespective of what sport it is that they are engaging in.
So listening to you, early sampling is important. Sampling as many sports as possible, considering those as potentially, whether you call them donor sports, but donating certain skills such as perceptual cognitive skills, the anticipation, decision making side of things is potentially there. The joy of moving, of running, of playing and sampling these sports, all of that you're putting over and above everything else. And then over time, once you've got that layer of early sampling, should a young person want to then go on and take a sport more serious, or uh, participate in this one sport more so than others, then absolutely. And then the question mark is, okay, how good can they get at that sport? Is everything within that sport coachable?
Yeah, but look, that would infer that somebody's got the secret sauce to identify, what somebody's going to look
Mm.
like in 5 years' time. If I read your previous comment right there, that there's almost this prediction of what this athlete's going to look like in 5 years' time, and they really need to knuckle down and engage in practice. Um, then yes, there might be a set of boundary markers, let's call it that, to use a technical term, competencies that athletes might need to hit in order to arrive at a point in 4 or 5 years' time where they are let's say, world class in something, or they're of a standard that would be seen as professional or elite. Um, Very easy to have those things that you can then reverse engineer, isn't it? So from a rugby perspective, it might be, if we say it's a 10 and it's a specialist role, their ability to kick at goals, kick out of hand, kick through a defence, their ability to pass off a left hand and a right hand, their ability to coordinate a team into a particular type of shape in a particular part of the field. From a psychological perspective, it might be around composure, giving themselves time on the ball, ability to read a defensive line, a backfield, um, real close skills around goal kicking. So yes, all of these things you can identify and you could probably measure, and then engage in some form of program of development over 3 or 4 years. But that shouldn't negate the idea that this individual should still take joy in what it is that they do, and uh, playing games, engaging in play has to be part of what it is that they do, rather than an overemphasis on time on task. Right, we're going to go out and kick 50 balls at goal tonight. Is that really enjoyable for that kid? Now, that kid might really enjoy it, and you might find that kid that really enjoys um, task mastery, and engaging in you know developing their skill to a point where it is absolutely unshakable under pressure. Then fine, you found that kid. But I would argue that that kid isn't necessarily everywhere. They're the exception rather than the norm.
There are a few standard deviations away from the norm. You've captured my question very well, and I probably didn't articulate myself greatly, but you're absolutely spot on. In as much as I suppose I borrow a bit from my own experiences and I lend from a few stories, one of which was the development of Javi Hernandez. And this is a very surface level viewpoint of Javi Hernandez in as much as it's through his own words, but he talked about his development between the age of 12 and 14 years old, where at La Masia, the Barcelona Football Academy, they did a lot of sort of small-sided games in small areas, if you like, in an attempt. And this is La Masia, so this is the best of the best for young kids, and one can argue the ethics of that, but uh, uh, they're trying to develop the perceptual cognitive skills alongside the technical skills, the ability to search, decide, and execute, the perception action side of things, whichever direction you want to go there. And he talks about the importance of experiencing that at that young age. And Professor Guy Jordet, who's been on the show, Norwegian Institute of Sport professor of sports and a leading expert on visual exploratory behaviours, so scanning, talks about young players having some kind of insight at around that age that potentially, I think he's hypothesizing that kind of insight potentially makes the difference in their development. And I kind of, listening to what you've said, I love what you've said, in as much as I think you're bridging both worlds there. I just wonder, I suppose where I'm going here, I wonder if it's and also rather than either or, that we can help young people experience sport in the most ethical manner, the most joyous manner that we possibly can, with a lot of early sampling, for example, so they get to experience multiple sports, multiple environments, multiple friendships, multiple coaching, and yet at the same time, at some point, I do believe there can be a soft introduction, not necessarily through deliberate practice, but a soft introduction to the kind of skills that are going to be valuable within that sport later on, where it's kind of been reverse engineered in a safe and healthy way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, 100%. And look, I'll try and be consistent with what I said earlier on. And there's a couple of things maybe to delve back into what I said. First and foremost, I identified one of the problems when I arrived at my rugby club that I'm in just now was rugby IQ. And I think what you're potentially talking about here is the ability for athletes not just to scan um, and see, but to understand. And therefore, if we are creating opportunities where the perceptual system is being challenged in the context of the environment because we're putting pressure on time and space, let's say if it's a rondo or tiki taka, in football, or we're playing some small-sided games within a rugby context, the coach has a responsibility to support athletes to develop the resources to understand what it is that they've just seen. Um, Therefore, they can unlock those experiences should they be confronted with the same picture, the same cue, or the same clue later on within their development. And so, if I talk about the coach developer's role, is to recognize coaches as having resources, and education forms part of that. And my role is to recognize they are both resourceful and have resources, and my job's to allow them to unlock that. Same too for the coaches. So if an athlete doesn't necessarily understand what it is that's just happened to them, then it's the coach's job to support them to make sense of that, so that if they are confronted with that another time, they have that experience to rely upon. And of course, what we're trying to do is support the athlete to develop those cognitive resources, i.e., knowledge, over time, mental models, so that when we go into, if we want to get into decision making, when we get into this sort of notion of recognition primed decision making, then there are some patterns, some cues, and some clues within a defensive or an offensive line that might lead the athlete to unlock that particular resource, because it's the best tool for what it is that they're facing at that moment in time. So yes, I know I've gone around the houses here, but I absolutely agree with you that play shouldn't be done just for play's sake. There is a coachable moment within all of that. And part of that is allowing, or is coaches supporting athletes to make sense of what happened to them right there and then, so that they can understand how decisions are made in context.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, play not just for play's sake. There's coachable moments within play, 100%, and mindful of time and wanting to be respectful of time, and actually leaving it at a point where I could probably go on speaking with you for the next hour on this stuff. I think it's absolutely fascinating and just digging a bit deeper. But that means we definitely got to get you back onto the show if you'll be willing to come back on. Derek, thank you so much for that conversation. You mentioned being on X, so how can people find you, follow you, and potentially get in touch?
Yeah, nothing. There's much to be followed, but yeah, they can just find me on X as at Coach Curious. Equally, more than happy for people to reach out via email. It's derek.o'riordan@stir.ac.uk.
Brilliant, Derek. Can't thank you enough for your time. Thank you.
No, I really appreciate it, Dan. I love what you do. So yeah, thanks, and I'm really privileged to have been part of the show at some point. So thank you.
Thank you, mate. Privilege is mine. Well, everyone, I really enjoyed that podcast episode, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook, or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.